Okay, so without much further ado, hi, welcome everybody joining us for the relaunch of our robotics CS department reading slash seminar group. We're kicking off this week, this semester, with our first speaker, and I'm very happy to welcome Tabitha Lee to our seminar. Tabitha Lee is a roboticist and a PhD student in robotics at the Carnegie Mellon University. She's a member of the Intelligent Autonomous Manipulation Group, headed by Professor Oliver Kremer. And her PhD research is in causal robot learning for manipulation. Specifically, she investigates the interplay between robot perception and control through the lens of causality to learn and leverage the causal structure of manipulation tasks. And exactly also to talk about this, she is here today. And I think I'm not going to waste any more time describing her because I'm far more interested to hear what she has to say about her own research.
Well, great. Thanks so much, Klaus, for that really wonderful introduction. Thank you, Klaus, Renard, and Igor for organizing the seminar. I'm really honored to be here and being the first speaker to kick off the seminars. I appreciate it so much. So I'm just going to share my screen here. Can everyone see this okay? Okay, I see a thumbs up. Wonderful.
Yeah, we can see it.
Perfect, thank you. I think Klaus, you mentioned pretty much all the things that, thank you for mentioning those things. And also thank you again. I'm happy to be here. And so thank you, Toronto. So a bit of a meta context slide first for the talk. My research interest in causality sort of have arisen over the last couple of years, but in particular, kind of some of my previous research in industry and also in field robotics to kind of see, okay, what approaches work in field robotics, what don't, like what does learning, what can we do better with learning that way that we can't do already. So this talk is sort of like the first, like I would say, step of my PhD thesis that I will be proposing. Fingers crossed, end of this semester, but pretty soon. We have a follow-up work that we're just about to submit that addresses some of the assumptions that we make in this work. So in this particular work, some of the assumptions might be on the stronger side, but we really sort of wanted to look at, okay, what would happen if we have all these right toolkits that one would need to do causal inference, and here's some of the things that we could get out of it. So we are in the process of relaxing these assumptions. Feedback for the talk is absolutely welcome. You can jump in at any time during my talk. I'm not the greatest at monitoring the chat in real time, but I'll try to take breaks. And if you want to wait until the end of the discussion, that's fine too.
Don't worry, I will monitor the talk and wait for the chat and wait for a lull.
All right, perfect. Thank you. So let's go ahead and jump in. The particular setting of robot learning that I'm most interested in is this idea of transfer learning, where you have a robot that, for example, you can get from the robot store, hopefully, and you can just put it into your kitchen or your restaurant or your hospital without necessarily seeing the environment that is being deployed to. So for this particular work, this is we're looking at transfer learning in particular, like a one-way transfer. And we want the robot to be able to conduct a variety of useful tasks with different type of manipulation skills. In realistic environments, there's a rich diversity of objects the robot could potentially interact with, but we can't really guarantee that the robot has particularly seen any one of these. They could have, they could not, we're not really sure. So let's look at this one particular example of this kitchen here. And let's say we want the robot to say, hey, robot, I want to turn on the hot water. So if the robot doesn't know how to do this, the robot will need to reason about what type of features in the state space it might need to understand in order to complete the task. And so we can attempt to enumerate these. And as a sort of to take a step back, sort of my research tends to do an object-centric view of the world. So that's kind of will be, that assumption is kind of like latent in here, just to point that out. But because this is a realistic environment, there's a number of different features. Some are important, some are not important, like the saucepan mask. Like, it exists, yes, but is it important? Well, unless you have a prior knowledge, you're not really sure. So what's the poor robot to do? So this sort of motivates this question about what features matter for a policy. And in particular, relatedly, how does one construct a state space? So for existing approaches, there's a couple that I will identify. The first is that this could be hand engineered if it's known a priori. For example, OpenAI gym environments, you can just look into their code and say, okay, this is the state space. However, this takes human effort, and we'd like a way to do this autonomously. Another approach is to do off-policy exploration in the scene. This would be a class of approaches where the robot is interacting in the scene, but there's too many objects, and it's hard to say that's scalable either. So a third approach that I will talk a little bit more about is this idea of sim-to-real transfer. In particular, you transfer knowledge, typically through representation learning in simulation where samples are cheap, and then deploy it in reality. So to give more information, it's possible that everyone on the call knows about sim-to-real, but I just very briefly, in this particular example, let us say that the robot could have simulation, for example, of training kitchens that it could basically train its policy on. It will construct a policy using all features, and through representation learning, the policy implicitly learns what is or isn't important, and it transfers to the test kitchen. Now, it is quite possible this will work, but there are some challenges to this approach. The first is that this creates very large policies, particularly because the state space is quite large, and it takes a lot of data in order to find the right representations that is what you want for the task. Because it's a large policy, it's unclear how well you can fine-tune the policy. By that, I mean the robot collecting samples in the test kitchen to sort of update its networks. Another challenge might be that it might learn unwanted spurious correlations, and this will be maybe more evident later on in my talk why we don't want spurious correlations, because they introduce unnecessary complexity. And the third, probably the one particular challenge, is this idea of domain shifts, where there is some shift in the distribution between the training data and your test data. And if it's the case where your neural network was trained in a particular training environment and is testing on a different, and there's a domain shift, like this may cause the policy to fail due to brittleness because of this. And a common example of this is, like, for example, a domain shift due to lighting. So if you're in the kitchen, the sun rises a certain angle, and all of a sudden your robot's not turning on the hot water, it's picking up an apple in the next room. So we want to understand, well, is there a way maybe we can do this a little bit, reason about this a little bit differently. So to sort of motivate our approach, we wanted to sort of like ask you, the human, what features would you want? And so the way we kind of approached it is this idea of intuitive reasoning with sort of a cheap and approximate internal model of the world. In this particular way, one can sort of quickly reason about the things that are or are not relevant, and then use these features, and then construct that policy accordingly. So this is particularly example of the motivation for this particular work. And so the robot can use this internal model. So this slide is basically a overarching, like, this is the TLDR, I would say, of the talk, is this idea of structural sim-to-real, which is we want to learn the structure of a manipulation policy using an internal model. And then we want to transfer and fine-tune that in the real world, or the target domain. So I'm going to use the word structure quite a bit in this talk. And what I mean by that is the architecture, the inputs in particular to the policy, like what features do you need that the network takes as input. So we're transferring the weights of the policy, but we're also transferring the structure. And so it would look something like this, where we have a source domain here, which is for our work, it's an internal model. And we are transferring it to the target domain, which is the real world and our real robots. And if sort of the one approach to this problem is to construct a large network with lots of features that the policy learns implicitly what is relevant, what our approach does is identifies the relevant variables first, and then constructs the policy accordingly, trains it in the source domain, and then transfers it to the target domain. So I will pause here very briefly. If there's any questions, I can address. It's okay if not, just. Okay.
Yeah, I think I'm interested in how you identify the relevant variables, but I assume you will get to this later.
Yes, it is. That's a very core part of the problem. And yeah, so that's sort of like the third part of my talk here. So in terms of the related works that we leaned on for this work, one particular area of interest is intuitive physics and internal models. In particular, for this work, we assume that we have a model that could be described at one of these works that admits causal interventions. The research in order to come up with this is something we're also interested in doing, but we, for this work, wanted to explore what you could do with it. The second area of related works is in causal reasoning and reinforcement learning. So some current approaches try to induce causal behaviors, but our work in particular is using causal reasoning to figure out what features you want and then constructs the policy accordingly. Our work is also related to this idea of state dimensionality reduction or attention, this idea of what matters for the robot. And instead of sort of like learning an implicit attention, we learn an explicit attention. You could say that's encoded in the structure of the policy itself. And lastly, our work relates to sim-to-real transfer of policies, particularly in the presence of domain shifts. And our goal for our work is to make our neural networks or our policies small enough so that in the presence of domain shifts, you can efficiently fine-tune them in the target domain. So in order to kind of to describe this entire pipeline, I want to first motivate each of these different components to make sure we're all sort of clear about the overall scope of the problem. So we will be doing learning a policy that's actually going to be decomposed into two different parts. The first is a low-level policy, which relates to the actuation of the robot. You can think of this at the joint torque level of the robot. And a high-level policy whose goal is to generalize the low-level policy over a particular context. And in particular for our work, we assume that we are given a low-level policy with certain parameters and known preconditions. For the preconditions, this is basically the robot knows when the policy can be executable. However, in work that we're currently working and will be submitting very shortly, we've actually been able to relax this assumption, which we're very excited about. But for this work, we assume it's known. So the goal of our robot is to learn this high-level policy, and we're going to be using a parameterized action space MDP framework, which is, you could sort of, it's related to the idea of options, and this idea of, instead of a sequential decision-making process at a small granular level, we're actually going to be taking a decision for a high-level policy parameters, rolling that out to the end of the environment, getting a reward, and then seeing how well we do.
So can I ask a question?
Yes.
What are the preconditions here? In what form are they given?
So the preconditions we are typically assumed is either it could be a probabilistic or a classifier, which basically tells the robot that the policy can be executed and sufficiently in order to complete the task.
Great, thank you.
Of course. Yeah. So the inputs to the high-level policy, in particular, is this context vector, which I'll talk about more. And this is the features that I described earlier in my motivation. And so the output is the policies for the low-level parameters. And we want to note here, and this will come up later, that only probably a few number of the context variables could possibly be relevant for this task. And for this work, we looked at 3 different types of models for what this high-level policy could be. For the first model, this is our baseline model. What we're doing is we're going to assume that the entire context vector could possibly be relevant, and through representation learning, the policy can learn how to predict the outputs of can predict the parameters of the low-level policy. So we call this a baseline MLP, multi-layer perceptron. And we have 2 models for this work. I will primarily be talking about the first one, although I have many backup slides that we can dive into the others, mostly in the interest of time to make sure I can keep to about 30 minutes, and happy to have a discussion about any other parts of the paper. So the first type model is what we call the reduced MLP, which is saying, okay, well, if the robot knows what tau is, which tau is a set of reduced context variables, let's create a MLP that only takes those as input. The other model we look at is something we call a partitioned MLP, which is similar to this idea of the reduced MLP. However, it's the relevant parameters, or sorry, relevant context variables per parameter. So you could sort of think of these as neural networks that are concatenated together. The identification of which variables that you would want here, I will get to in a couple of slides, and that's the algorithm CREST that we use. In order to reason about what these variables are, we assume that we have an internal model. So I want to talk a little bit more about what we're assuming the internal model has, the current limitations, and what it affords for causal reasoning. So we assume that the internal model is reasonably approximate to the task. It doesn't have to match it exactly, but it has to be at least somewhat approximate. And in the paper, we didn't really look at how close it has to be so far that it's close. So particularly for our internal models, we use kinematic models, and it has some task transition function and a task reward function. So these are known, and that the internal model can be constructed, like the scenes can be constructed deterministically from the context vector. So this would be like the robot saying, I want to consider a world where objects are in this particular configuration. You could sort of think of this like the setting a random number generator deterministically with like a random seed. So this is the way we look at it, is like this is a seed for the scene. So this is important to be able to reason what changes and what doesn't change. We're only considering scenes where the task is feasible. So things like objects existing in the same place in space is not allowed. And we're assuming, and this is an important assumption and maybe a strong one, but we are assuming that the context space representation admits causal interventions, and in particular that this is disentangled. And so like disentangled learning is also a hard thing as well, but we wanted to sort of approach this as well. What if we had these tools? What can we do? So this is what we're assuming from the internal model. So this slide is going to be just taking a step back and looking at the overall pipeline from what we discussed and putting it together. So the sim-to-real pipeline is typically we pre-train a policy using domain randomization in simulation, and then we transfer this to the target domain, which could be the real world. In particular,
what type of, if I may ask, what type of randomizations do you use in domain randomization? Like what type of augmentations, sorry?
Sure. So this is a really great question, because I've also done different work relating to domain randomization for images and transferring images. And for the domain randomization for this work, what we're doing is over the context variables that the robot knows about. It has some space that it knows that the values that they can take. And then it basically will sample randomly from this space and train the policy accordingly. In some of our transfer experiments, what we do is that we actually shift this space to kind of look at what would happen if you had a data set domain shift. But does that answer your question, or can I clarify that anymore?
No, that's good. Thanks.
Sure. So in our pipeline, we are the thing that is different from our work is this idea first about using CREST and to identify the relevant variables. So then the rest of the pipeline is similar, where we're pre-training them, but only on the relevant variables. So the next part we'll be talking about the CREST, which is how we determine the causal reasoning. So the algorithm CREST that we use is a 3-step process. I am first going to walk through the second step. I have the third step in slides in backup that I'm happy to get to after the talk, because I gave a version of this talk for my speaking qualifier a couple of months ago, and it went quite longer than 30 minutes. So I first would like to get the 30 minutes done. But the process is basically, first, given a particular scene, a particular layout of the world, we want to find what policy parameters theta are, what that would solve the scene. And in principle, you can use a variety of techniques. We use relative entropy policy search to do this, but other types of policy search methods are fine. In particular, note that we're only finding theta for that one scene. So we're not generalizing over the scene itself. We're just saying, okay, deterministically, if the scene is always this, what value of parameters would solve it? With that data, which is the context vector and the solved parameters, the second step of CREST, which I'll get to, so I have a couple slides describing this, is we conduct interventions in order to find what the relevant variables are. And so intuitively, the question that the robot is asking is sort of a question that is, if a context variable was different, would the same policy execution work? And with that information, that's enough to construct the reduced NLP policies. And the third step of CREST is we actually resolve the interventions that we do in order to find the per parameter relevant variables. And excuse me. And the question here is, does changing a relevant context variable require a policy parameter to be changed? So in order to dive a little bit more into our reasoning here, we're going to go a little bit further into the step 2 of CREST here. So if you were to think about what this structured learning algorithm is trying to do, first consider the possibility that the robot has some space of context variables that it might know about. And it's basically trying to decide, okay, what are the edges between each of these variables and the rest of the policy? In particular, at this stage of CREST, we assume that we have a solution to a particular context. So what that might look like is in this little block world diagram here, for some particular layout of the world C, we have some parameters theta, which can lift the block up and over into the goal position. So the stage 2 of CREST is going to be doing interventions in order to figure out whether or not this edge should exist. And in particular, so it does this parameter by, it does this context variable by context variable by changing the value of this context variable through interventions, and then seeing if there's any change to the reward, which also changes whether the task was solved. So to give you an example what this would look like, consider now that I have this intervention here that I've conducted, and you can see that the position of the block has moved from C over here now to this value. Now what the robot is doing is going to redeploy this theta parameter here, and you can see that there's probably not going to be much change to the reward. There might be a little just due to stochasticity, but this is just a knob in the algorithm we can tune. But typically you would think this probably shouldn't matter. You can still complete this task with the same theta parameters, even though this particular value is different. And so what this tells us is that this particular variable, which is the position of this block, is irrelevant. And for the task, it's irrelevant for the task. And so what that means is we're just going to delete the edge, not going to worry about it. And so we're just going to forget this variable for the rest of the problem.
Can I, this is really interesting. Can I actually ask a question about this?
Yes.
So if I understand correctly, you are excluding one variable, or actually changing one variable, and then solving the problem from the beginning with that setting of the context variable. And if there is no difference, I guess, in the solution, then that context variable is irrelevant. Is that correct, or did I misunderstand it?
Yes, I would say that's correct. And I think one thing I can also mention is that we conduct for the same variable, we do conduct a number of interventions along a particular space. So it's not just like we pick one. So we actually are assessing a distribution
I see.
That it can take. And if over this distribution, and the important assumption earlier about the representation being disentangled, sort of like lets us kind of do this, without worrying too much about entanglement. So again, that's a strong assumption, but I mean, this is the assumption of the work. But yeah,
yeah, this is super interesting. Super interesting. So I'm wondering if this is actually efficient in the space of in the size of the context variables. So is there a way to basically say to place a limit on the number of times you have to resolve the problem? Let's say you were only allowed to solve it, k times. Is there a way, but you had much more than k context variables? Is there a way to sort of figure out which of the context variables were relevant or not?
This is a really good question, and I think this kind of relates to some of the challenges that we're sort of like currently facing, and not like this work, but our ongoing work, where we actually are through this entire space, like solving CREST, and then but over context spaces above, I would say 50 or so, it starts to get kind of slow. So again, it's a matter of finding out perhaps heuristics to say, well, maybe you could do some type of reasoning with respect to this part of the space. If the solutions I found here are, maybe that would inform like, okay, maybe there's, I only have to do this variable by variable consideration for maybe like a subset that's like some nearest neighbors to that. I absolutely agree that in general, this will not scale if the context is 1,000 or 2,000. But one of the things that is kind of interesting to me about at least human intuition is, in terms of the particular concepts that we know about, we still have a really interesting way of just quickly down selecting maybe a couple of these, thinking about the cause and effect and reasoning about the outcome. So I do think that there could be another layer on top of this, which is to say, okay, maybe through some heuristics, maybe the nearest k objects, what are the features that I know about, put them together, and then run this algorithm. But yes, this is a great point you're making.
Do you think it would be possible, suppose you had a magical RL algorithm that you could pass derivatives through the optimization process and figure out whether there is any, the Jacobian of the loss, the Jacobian of the loss with respect to some of these context variables? Would you expect the Jacobian of that loss function to be 0 for the irrelevant variables?
I would say I believe that would be the case, because it's also related to this idea of like locally there's no change to the solution. So I believe it would be, I believe that would be the case. Yes, without sort of looking at it myself, I believe that would be true.
Okay.
Before we get into a longer discussion at that point, I would suggest that we let Tabitha finish her talk, and then we can dive right back in.
Sure, yeah, sorry.
Oh no, I appreciate the questions. And thank you for the really rich discussion so far. I appreciate it. So the next example I was going to give was a case where it is relevant. I think intuitively, I think maybe perhaps we've sort of realize what is going on here. If it affects the reward function, it's going to decide its relevance and then keep the edge. So this is the part of structural learning, which is to say, what edges do you need? So the output of this is from this context vector that you originally had. You've identified tau, which is the set of the relevant variables you actually want to use. And so now what you're going to do is be putting these as input to the neural network. So as opposed to, so this is sort of like, as I mentioned before, you could really think of the idea of like this explicit attention, which is just saying, okay, we're just going to, just not even let the network think about these other inputs. And, we've decided we're not going to let the network see data from that part of it. And so, yeah, so that's how we construct the reduced NLP policies. So for the next part of the talk, I have some experiments here. I didn't go through all the experiments. I have REST in the backup slide. So I wanted to highlight a few of the results that we had that are sort of like representative of the work. So we wanted to look at two different manipulation tasks. The first was block stacking, which is a very, very classical pick and place. But another one is we tried to look into is crate opening, which is maybe closer to like a nonlinear problem. And so for the full details, I have backup slides if you want to talk into that. But in particular, I wanted to emphasize two experiments. One, what happens during a domain shift, and sort of like the brittleness of some current approaches if a domain shift occurs. And then also we were able to do zero-shot transfer on a real robot, and I have videos, so wanted to show that. In terms of the evaluation methodology, we wanted to be very rigorous in terms of making claims for how many samples it needs to converge. So in order to do this, what we do is we run each trial 10 times. We construct and randomly initialize the policy. We train it with the internal model because the internal model, is a fast and approximate simulation. So you might as well just try to use that as to bootstrap to where you want in the target domain. You transfer to the target domain, you check for zero-shot transfer, and if it doesn't zero-shot transfer, then you begin fine-tuning. And so after a certain number of iterations, you then redeploy the policy, see, okay, is this good or not? And so in particular, what we're doing is we're doing this way because we want a policy that works, and we don't really want to train more than that because target samples are very expensive. So in terms of the training process, we use PPO. We use the same hyperparameters for all networks. We try to really make it maybe as close to apples that we could. And so for our target domain, we primarily did experiments using NVIDIA Isaac GIM. So NVIDIA Isaac GIM is a really interesting, a really cool high-fidelity physics simulation. And in particular, one of the nice things that it affords is a way to collect experiments like in parallel. So on a GPU cluster, you can run this in parallel, collect lots of data very quickly. And these videos here are showing the robots collecting the data sort of like in parallel. So the data all gets kind of aggregated, and then the update gets put together, and then it gets sent back out to all the robots. So actually right now, what it's in the videos, they're deploying the task, the solved task for block stacking and then crate opening. Another nice thing about doing this is that it enables us to methodically test distribution shifts that are experimentally quite hard. If I was to show domain shifts for all sorts of variables, some are easier than others, like positions of things, like not a problem, but color, dimensions, it's a lot harder. So we kind of use Isaac GIM as our proxy for the target, but then we also show the transfer to the real robot later too. So it's not just on Isaac GIM. So I just wanted to show a video of maybe close up, and I might skip a little bit on the details on the representation here because I think there's maybe more richer discussion for like how to decide what the variables are relevant or not. So I'm going to then go to very quickly to the next slide on the experiment where we're transferring under a color shift. So this particular experiment, instead of training over the entire color space, which is 0 to 1, what we're doing is first, okay, let's assume the robot only knew that color could exist from 0 to 0.5. So we train our models under this assumption, and then we transfer it to the target domain for 2 cases. The first is when there's no domain shift, just to understand how well it transfers. And then we also shift it to a domain where we have, it's sort of like a worst case scenario where the color is, in this case, an irrelevant variable to the problem, and it's actually a completely different space than what you saw before. So now in the target domain, you only ever see blocks from 0.5 to 1. So in particular, I want to call to your attention a few numbers, because there's a number of numbers on here. The first is that comparing the difference between performance for the target domain when there is a shift and when there's not a shift. So if there's not a shift, all the policies generally transfer more or less 0 shots. There's a little bit of extra fine tuning involved for the baseline, but under this domain shift, again, sort of emblematic of there's something in the world that the robot didn't know about. What we see here is that the MLP has a significant sort of reduction to number of samples because it's taking this data as input, to the policy. By construction, ours are robust to this because they're not even part of the policy to begin with. So I have, I think, 2 or 3 more slides. And okay, so the robot videos. So it is block stacking, so it's probably not the most exciting thing, but this is, we were very excited to have it work on a real robot. So the internal models that we used to train, we deployed it on the robot here. You will note that the vertical position that it lifts up to is a way for us to sort of impose the preconditions. Again, the precondition assumption is something we relaxed in later work. But this is just so in order to meet the assumptions of the current work. And for this, we didn't use any AR tags. We use RGBD-based perception. So we just had a detector that was human engineered to output the parameters that the policy would need. So what we saw is in aggregate that our approach had more success for 0-shot transfer. So we didn't actually do fine tuning on the robot. We just did 0-shot transfer. I have 2 more slides. So the first is, so just overall thoughts on the work. So the idea here is like structural synthereal. So if there's a possibility of transferring policies with a certain structure that have been constructed through causal reasoning, under the assumptions of our work, we were getting very exciting results in terms of policies being smaller, they're more efficient to learn and robust to domain shifts. So one question is, we make all these assumptions, why would we do this? One reason is because in my mind, I view this as part of building towards a causal robot learning system. And I'm not certain how far I'll get during my PhD on this, but it's something I'm very passionate about that I think would be very exciting. So I kind of see this as like one part of the problem, or at least like in that trajectory. I have another slide, which, okay, the caveat here is this is unpublished work, but we are submitting it very shortly, and hopefully, fingers crossed, it will be published work, pending reviews. But I wanted to at least share one of the assumptions that we made in the work that we actually were able to relax. So in order to kind of motivate this idea, let us assume we have a version of the problem where, again, it's block pick and place, but we have variations in 2 dimensions of the context space. So it is possible that the target block could vary in 1 dimension and the obstructing block could vary in another. So if you were to visualize this in a 2-dimensional space, what ends up occurring is that there's actually a class of policies that here only sort of depend on the source block and the target block because the obstructing block is no longer in the way. And in fact, like if you were to plot a line here, you would send, okay, like solutions on this one side tend to have this type of form. And in particular, when the obstructing block is taller than the target, then the robot just can't just up and over, right? It has to go up, over, and then down. So to get out of the way of the obstructing block. And so very excitingly, what we're able to do is run CREST over this entire space. And so each of these samples here are an output of CREST and sort of do some it's a 1-class SVM to kind of do density estimation of, okay, this is a region of similar samples. and this is a region of similar samples. And I'm very excited about this. And so it actually seems to work for this really small problem. Fingers crossed for more challenging problems. But for the selection of the robot, being able to decide which of these skills I would want to use, so skill being like the solution of policies, this is kind of what you would expect. Like in this part of this space, it picks one. This part of the space, it picks the other. So with that, I have a thank you slide. This could not have been possible without all my amazing collaborators. My PI, Oliver, is amazing. He's very supportive. The rest of the team at the IM Lab, I'm very grateful to be working with them. And with that, I'm officially concluded with the talk. So I will pause here and happy to have any questions that you might have.
Yeah, thanks so much for the wonderful talk. It's been super interesting. I think there is a question in the chat actually by Animesh. Animesh's question was, Animesh, do you want to ask in person or shall I just read?
This was wonderful. I particularly like this this line of work. I have two questions. First is you mentioned about these sort of relevant variables and this sort of pipeline. First, and maybe a very simple question is, do you propose that we don't do end-to-end learning? Or do you want us to do end-to-end learning? Because this is the part that is not clear to me. How do you learn, let's say, relevant features without feedback from the task? If you do have feedback from the task, then why do this at all?
Sure, it's a very good question. In particular, I feel the sort of the passion I have for causality is also sometimes tempered with, in robotics, like, there's a little bit of tension between these two. And I think, exploring the ground between these is really exciting. I think you bring up really good points. Particularly for this work, we assume that the task the robot is trying to solve is defined through a reinforcement learning framework. But I often feel that for some of the richer sort of intuition, problem solving, I believe reinforcement learning is a very important part. But it almost feels like there's another component possibly where maybe you would use a pipeline through causal reasoning to connect concepts together and then use reinforcement learning with a concept there. Again, this is sort of my idea for like causal robot learning. So I could be 10 years away from this idea. I could be 100 years, I don't know.
I could ask a follow-up question here, right? Okay, so generally, and I'm not picking on you, to be very, very clear. Generally, when we talk about causality in two different domains, let's look at econometrics or health versus robotics, or even computer vision broadly, the causal graph in vision and robotics, in the examples that we have seen, and I want to be very clear again that I'm not picking on you, is actually very small subset. So the kind of graph that you showed initially is this graph where I can basically say, let me give you a very simple example. You need a system where the reward, the way you define the reward is independently dependent on n variables. You presume disentanglement. And if you look at this causal structure, you basically have k independent variables, all resulting in one effect variable. Let's call that reward or cost, or does not matter what you end up. But the structure is very simple. Yes, all of such graphs are causal, but you don't need causal infrastructure to do any of this reasoning. I could even argue that if you give me enough data, I can train a generative model that will do disentanglement for me. Let's say VAEs or GANs already do that for images. People have shown that you can do that for videos as well, right? So, for example, in these setups, you don't show observed and unobserved confounders, right? That there is a variable that shows up in the reward function, not directly, but through another equation, through let's say a mechanism that is not direct. How would you sort of go about that?
Sure. Yeah, and these are very good points too. I think you're right. We didn't talk about things for this work in terms of unobserved variables, possible co-founders. I'm hoping that because at least to sort of like scope the work, we needed to make certain assumptions, and I am aware of the work being done in causal discovery, which is exactly the idea of where are these variables, like how do you pick them. Maybe there's some type of, in the same way I'm thinking of SLAM, right, simultaneously localizing and mapping, it's this iterative process between reasoning about what matters, looking if it doesn't, and converging to something that sort of has the structure you want. I totally will admit that it's, there's a lot of assumptions we make in the work, but I think it's sort of exciting to see maybe that there's a little bit of progress, and maybe it can form other approaches possibly.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for asking.
Okay, I have one more question on the context variables. I also found this approach super interesting. To me, it reminded me a little bit of like sensitivity analysis. Basically, you take some variable and you see how sensitive it is to perturbations. And one of the problems if you do like per variable sensitivity analysis is that in other parts of the state space, one variable that is basically not important may become important. And how is this thing handled in your system? Is this not a problem simply because you assume that you have always the same setup?
Right, exactly. And again, this is sort of the assumption for a representation being disentangled. But I do think it is a richer step forward to be able to say, for example, maybe possibly connect this to our motivation here with transferring under a domain shift. It's possible that that domain shift arises because of an unobserved confounder. So is it possible that the robot can somehow identify that? I guess this is getting a bit into like causal discovery as well. So I think maybe you could view the work of, okay, if you had all the right pieces, maybe this would be something that would be really interesting. I do feel like for the work that I will put together for the PhD, I do absolutely want to look into these things, because I think these are things that need to be addressed in order for this causal robot learning to go with a press of a button. And so I think that's exactly a thing you're saying here.
I have one more question related to that, if nobody else has a question.
Sure, please do.
Okay, cool. So this sort of reliance on, do you think there is any reliance on the loss function of the RL algorithm once you have made a change in the context variables? Are you relying on the fact that you're going to, for the irrelevant variables, you're going to find the same loss? And that should happen, that maybe you expect that in theory, but do you expect to find that in practice?
This is a good question. I think there's absolutely a connection here with sort of like the loss function, because it's we reason about the output of the system in the reward, but back propagating this into the rest of the system, like I would suspect that the loss is in order for our approach to work, it must be the case that loss is also like when you kind of disconnect this part of the graph, that there's components of the loss that also kind of like reflect that as well. I think in practice, I think this goes into the sort of the assumptions about what would happen under unobserved confounders. And in that case, if you were to remove a variable, but it still shows up somehow in this loss function, I believe that would probably have the system would not work in that case, because the loss has to be accords with the variables that you have in there. So I view your comment as sort of like rhyming with the other comments as well, because that's absolutely the view of RL with it as well. But absolutely.
Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Hi, I have a question regarding the context variables. If I understand correctly, you are selecting a subset of context variable as input to the MLPs. I'm wondering, and you are doing interventions on context variable one by one. I'm wondering, why do you have the assumptions that context variable are independent and they are not affecting each other's? Like, would it be better to model the context variable as a graph and do interventions on that graph?
This is a great question, and I think the right. So the assumptions we make in disentanglement are exactly so that you could think of these as like independent possible causal mechanisms for the data that you see, which is at the end, which is the reward, what you get out. This is a great point you mentioned about the possibility of this context actually being a graph. And I think there's some work, I think by Bernard Scholkoff's group, that sort of motivate that idea that the graph, it's like the scene itself arises because of a graph. And so in the work that we're about to submit, I mean, this is sort of this idea of if you have a block that's always on the table, the position, the vertical position of it is constrained to maybe like half of the height, for example. So in that case, under that assumption, the data for that variable is actually dependent. And so you can express this as a graph. So I would say that you absolutely could do this. And I think this is actually one step forward for the work to make it more richer and more amenable to sort of the real world constraints we have in robotics.
Thank you.
Okay, are there any more questions? I think this is not the case. Then
I have one question.
Please, Animesh,
Sorry.
yeah. No worries. Go ahead.
This is independent of the algorithm that you've been using. So far, we have been thinking about causality in robotics a lot as well. And I would just be very curious to know about your thoughts, things that have published, not published, or things that you're still sort of mulling over. Experimental domains that would be interesting from a perspective of causality. So far, we have come to the conclusion, and I'm not, again, we also had this problem where we basically racked our brains and everything we came up with was a kind of block world environment. What sort of non-block world environments can we have for studying the exact same problem? Something that would like also interest people in high-speed control, dexterous manipulation. I know, for example, Oli works on many things that are dexterous control and not block world stuff, like cutting or something. So any ideas?
Yeah, great question. I think the one thing that comes to mind, it's maybe less of a sort of like a splashy demo, but I feel like this type of approach could be really amenable to lifelong learning. In particular, making like these policies like as small as possible. Just so then it's just reasoning of like, oh, is this model that I have correct or not correct? Yes or no. That gives you really strong understanding of whether you need to train the policy or not. I agree with you in terms of because ultimately it's pick and place, and in our unpublished work, it's also pick and place. But it's something that I do feel like tying back to the original motivation, where we have kitchens. Like I want to see what realistic tasks can we do in this kitchen. It's hard. I'm not sure I have a good answer for a particular task, but I believe over the lifetime of a task, I feel like that would be.
I think the main point I was trying to make is for internally people who are working on robotics, not robotics, like causality in robotics. Is it necessary or valuable to do real robot experiments? Because in what you would say, these block world environments, it takes a non-trivial amount of engineering to convert this. And as you said, we do zero-shot transfer with some amount of engineering on the perception, right? But if you're truly interested in studying causality or causal inference in robotics, then like as a devil's advocate, I'm asking like, why bother doing the real robot stuff? At least in this setup, the marginal value is low, except for submitting to robotics reviewers who might just see this as like, yeah, it works on real robots.
Yeah, I completely understand. I think the maybe it's sort of like my own personal research interests in my past of doing field robotics, and being able to get this to a point where you can roll out a robot in a kitchen it hasn't seen before, and it's using causal inference to to interact, to learn from the world. As far as it relates to, because it's important to show progress, in papers by papers, there is that sort of tension as to say, we can show this for this small representative case, but I think it is also important to look at the bigger picture too, and saying like, if our goal is to put this in a kitchen and press go, how far away are we that? And I'm not sure if I have particularly good responses, but I want to say that these are good things that you're asking, because I think they're good questions.
Thank you a lot for this interesting work, and thank you for entertaining all of us with all of our sort of weird questions. So thank you for making time.
Yeah, thanks so much for your time, Tabitha. It's been a pleasure to hear you speak, and we wish you all the luck and success. And yeah, thanks for having been with us. To everyone else, I have posted links also to Tabitha's website. So if you want to contact her and discuss potential collaborations or more questions, just you will find in Slack the links, and feel free to reach out.
Yeah, perfect. Thanks so much. I appreciate the opportunity to talk. It was had a really good, interesting, fun research discussion, and please contact me if you want to talk about the work more. And thank you very much.
Yeah, thanks.